Airlines homebound WWII flight with a rehabilitated Ju-52 from North Africa to the Union of SA August 1943. Transcript from a tape of a talk given at Rotary, Zanin, taped by Len Hobson and typed by Penny Mannering the 21st of July 2000. Note: FM Len. Dates first and flying time will be in brackets. August of 1943, World War II. When the operations in North Africa came to an end, we were based on a landing field in the Cape Bon Peninsula, which is the northernmost part of Africa, opposite the Gulf of Tunis. It is near Tunis and Carthage. At that time, we moved across to Malta. I had 17 other ranks under me from flight sergeant downwards. They were due to return to the Union of South Africa, and there was nothing I could do to get them back to Cairo and from there back to the Union. I just had to leave them there. The best thing I can advise, I told them, is that you must bum a ride with the Yanks. The air base was straddled with broken Ju-52s, some on their noses, some on their side and some with a wing in the ground, lying all over the place. Jokingly, I said, if you build up a Ju-52, I'll fly the lot of you back to the Union. We then pushed off to Malta. Having forgotten all about it, I suddenly got a signal in Malta saying that the Ju-52 was ready for test flight. I didn't know a Ju-52, I'd never been in one. The Airways had a couple of Ju-52s. They had Wright Cyclone 360 horsepower motors, and they used to do about 130 miles per hour. We thought, well, we might not go quite so fast, maybe around 120 miles per hour. I flew across from Malta and landed there, Cape Bon, in a Baltimore, and I saw my Ju-52. It didn't have one single instrument on the dashboard. The Germans, when they left, they smashed all the instruments. I had nothing. I didn't have an airspeed indicator. I didn't have a fuel indicator gauge. I didn't have an oil pressure gauge, nothing. All it had was a relay compass that was situated right up high in the tail as far away from the engines as possible to cut down on the magnetic interference. So, I got into the old Ju-52 and revved up the old motors, no rev counter, but they sounded all right. I took the flight sergeant with me and opened the throttles and away we went and took off. We flew around the circuit and came in and landed and she behaved like a honey. All you have to do now is to sit tight until I get my marching orders, I said, and I'll fly the lot of you back to the Union. Anyway, we finished our tour of Malta, I saw the squadron over to Foggia in Italy, and then I got my marching orders. Then I got someone to fly me over to the peninsula in a Baltimore. We used the Baltimore to line up the Ju-52's compass. So we lined up the Baltimore and we lined up the old Ju-52 manually behind it, and we took the compass reading from the Baltimore and we made a note of the error in the compass of the Ju-52, and we repeated the procedure, north, east, south, west, etc. And we got the compass reasonably accurate. See documents. Now, when I came back to start the operation, there were 17 blokes and I said, well look, I'm taking a Mauser and 1,000 rounds of ammunition back to the Union, so the least I could do was to say to these blokes was that they could each take a Mauser and 1,000 rounds of ammunition. So we set off with 18 Mausers and 18,000 rounds of ammunition. I had a motor car at home, and tires were unobtainable during the war. So I said, who's got a motor car? And bloody well all of them put up their hands, and I set off with 56 motorcar tires. So, we set off from Cape Bon about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The next stop was intended Tripoli. I did not go right round the Gulf of Tunis. We set course across the sea and I was working on a ground speed of roughly 120 miles per hour. Anyway, the sun started to set and there was no blooming land in sight, so I thought, oops, I'd better alter course 30 degrees starboard, and by that time the sun had set, then we hit Africa. Now the twilight hours up there are virtually nothing. When the sun sets, it gets dark, 15 minutes minimum. We hit Africa in last light and flew along the coast and I hit Tripoli. And of course, Tripoli was blacked out because they were still operating from there and it was pitch black, so I thought, I can't land in Tripoli. I knew the Tripoli airport had tall buildings surrounding it, so I thought, I'm not going in there in the dark, so I went to Castel Benito. The 23rd of August, flying time 3.50 hours. Now these guys had made a damn good job of fixing the airplane, but they didn't have any paint to paint the swastika roundels on the side of the airplane. I didn't realize that I was to be the target, and there was a flare path in full operation. Now these guys had made a damn good job of fixing the airplane, but they didn't have any paint to paint the swastika roundels on the side of the airplane. I didn't realize that I was to be the target, and there was a flare path in full operation. There were aircraft taking off this beastly runway, and that's why it was lighted up. There was nobody taking off when I came down on the bloody treetops. Now it struck me there were swastikas on the airplane. I came in at treetop level and I saw one chap take off and I dragged this thing onto the runway with the 3 motors flat out and I saw a chap taxiing out. So I went whoops over his head, and slapped the thing down on the runway and ran to the far end, turned off and switched off and out came the security blokes and they formed a circle around us with their rifles at the ready. I opened the door and I held up my hands and I cried out, don't shoot, ons mens, don't shoot, and they turned out to be quite nice blokes. That night I played poker with the CO and a few of his buddies and I walked off with 27 pounds at the end of it and had the time of my life. I bummed full tanks of petrol from them and I set off for Marble Arch, 24th 3.20 hours. I didn't want to fly across the sea again to Benghazi, so I went to El Adam, 24th 3.05 hours, instead. Marble Arch is just a little station for motor vehicle transport. I landed at the depot, and found they had motor spirit. I had no movement papers, I had nothing with me but the operations were far away, but here I was flying a Jerry airplane with no papers, but anyway after a lot of talking I talked them into giving me some full tanks and we set off from Marble Arch. I landed at the next place and filled up with petrol and I nearly signed CS Coppen PP General JC Smuts. I could have gone straight across the desert, but I didn't fancy that, so I went round to Mersa Matruh, 24th 1.50 hours. At Mersa Matruh I battled to get petrol out of them. Then I landed at El Mazar, 25th 2.15 hours, that's the aerodrome closest to Cairo. There the captain was on the ball and here is this ruddy Jerry plane again, and they wanted to inspect the airplane. Well, I had 18 rifles and 18,000 rounds of ammunition and 56 motorcar tires and this is not any good for me. Luckily they had a T hangar, in which we hurriedly parked it, so we piled out of the airplane and I locked the door and they started to get a bit sticky. I went to Ville AV, can't make it out. Luckily there they had a staff officer and he had been with me and I knew him well in the Air Force as an attorney. I went to see him and said, look man, I've got a few problems. First of all, I want flight authorization for this airplane and I want a movement order for these 18 blokes back to the Union. He was a first-class bloke and he made out the necessary documentation and I went back to El Mazar and there I got out and showed the captain my flight authorization and marching orders. There was the Air Force operating from El Mazar and I managed to bum some petrol from them. And with full tanks, we set off from there on a rather long hop. In fact, I worked out my ground speed when we hit Africa on that first hop and it worked out to exactly 88 miles per hour instead of the 120 miles per hour that I had calculated. We took off from El Mazar and I landed at Luxor, 25th 2.50 hours. Luxor was luckily a training base for the SAF, and I managed to get some petrol out of them, and the next day we went from Luxor to Wadi Halfa, 30th 2.40 hours. A mate of mine, Colonel Kutsi, later had copped it. He knew what I was doing and he thought this is a damn good idea, so he also got his guys to build him a Ju-52. At Wadi Halfa the deck runway is snow white, and when the sun is overhead, with the glare of this, you honestly don't know if you are 5 or 50 feet off the ground, so they put a row of drums out and they make you fly by these drums and you really don't know where the ground is. It's like landing on clear, calm water. And my friend who copped it, who thought he was near the ground, he held off and wham, he crashed into the deck and wham, he broke his bloody neck. Frank and I were buddies for many years. So, we landed at Wadi Halfa with the help of these black painted drums and we got petrol from the SAF. The next day it was Wadi Sinda, 26 3.50 hours, near Khartoum. There I got petrol out of the RAF by filling in forms in triplicate and signing PP General J.C. Smuts again. The next leg was from Wadi Sinda to Wadi Malakal, 26 4.20 hours. At Wadi Malakal we had quite a bit of drama. Wadi Malakal is a long narrow tarmac strip in the middle of the Nile, and there's a little mutton bone on this side and on that side. I didn't say that I had 18 blokes, and a hell of lot of extra weight on board. Now the Airways were flying these planes with 12 passengers and luggage only, so we were grossly overloaded, and by the time I reached Wadi Malakal my access documents had started to bend quite a bit, and the brake linings were finished, so I had very little brakes. I landed all right and faced this mutton bone and I had to turn. I was doing 0 miles per hour, opened up the outside motor and she started turning, but not fast enough. I slapped the thing open to skid around and she accelerated and went off the bloody mutton bone, down into the bog, so we had a bit of a problem there. So I went to see the district commissioner and the old DC said, well, I can raise about 300 prisoners and various people, so I said, well, let's try. So he came out with his 300 odd bods, and these people all put their hands underneath that airplane, picked it up bodily, and put it on the tarmac. I again had to fight with the RAF for petrol and I got my tanks full of petrol, no problem with the takeoff. We went to Juba, 27th 2.5 hours, a nice big airdrome, no problems there. Then Kisumu, Kenya, 27th 3.20 hours, we had some drama. You had to cross the Ruwenzori Mountains, and they are 9,000 feet high, and so you have to fly at least 9,000 feet high to get above them. That was a guts of an altitude for these old junkers. So with wide open throttles you make a rush for it, and if you hit a slight downdraft and you are next to the side of the mountain, so you just turn away. I had about 10 goes at it and we couldn't make it, so I went back to Kisumu and I got another fill up of petrol and we had another go at it very early in the morning when the air was nice and dense, and we managed to get up to 9,000 feet and we got over the Ruwenzori Mountains with no further problems, and then we landed at Tabora, 28 3.10 hours. Tabora was a bloody awful airdrome to find. It's stuck in the damn forest, but there is a road going around the forest, so we steered way off till we hit the road and flew along the road till we hit the railway line and flew along beside it until we hit Kasama, 28 3.25 hours. It had a very short runway. I came in over the trees and slapped the thing down and we ran and we ran and we ran, and there the trees were coming up and the damn thing wasn't going any slower. I tried the brakes but no, nothing would help, and we got to the end and I thought, now we have got trouble. We are going to go into this bloody forest. So, I slapped the outboard engine open and started a ground loop. It was a very effective ground loop, but it put the wing in the bloody ground. But it was the tire, it didn't damage the wing, but it was the tire. At least we had lots of spares on board, but we had to get that bloody thing off the ground to put the spare wheel on, so off we went to the old DC again and he came out with a whole lot of munts and we packed them along the wing and we piled on munts, piled on months until the wing tipped up, and we just hoped that no month jumped off while we were busy changing the tire. We changed the tire, and after that, there was no more trouble. That was Kasama. Kasama to Lusaka 29th 3.20 hours, to Bulawayo 31st 2.45 hours, no problems. Then came the trouble coming into the Union. The CO at Pietersburg at the time was Carpi Martin. We were mates for a long time, so I landed at Pietersburg and I said, Carpi, I've got this problem. Well, it cost me 2 motorcar tires, and old Carpi said, okay, off you go. See documents. Now I had to get rid of the tires before we got back to Swartkop's Pretoria. So when we landed at Pietersburg, I didn't tell Carpi about this. I told the mechanics to take the bloody door off and put it inside. They put the door inside and we took off from Pietersburg, with a great big gulping hole in the side of the plane. Now my brother was managing a large estate on the flats. Springbok Flats. So, he had one big land and he had 4 tractors going up and down this land. I didn't say this before, but all the way down I had a chap at the back in the tail reading the compass, and he would say left, left, and we would give him the course to steer, and we would say left to this chap and he would say left to this chap. Now this airplane had a step inside, so I would call out to the chap standing next to me, who would call out to the chap at the step, who would call out to the chap at the back of the step, who would call out to the chap at the bottom of the tail, who would call out to the chap at the compass in the tail. I then lined up along this big land of my brother's, and I told the blokes to shove the tires out of the door when we got over the land. Tires were raining down from the aircraft and bouncing on the ground and then leaping into the air and bouncing in all directions over this land. The neighbor De Beer's tractor driver got such a fright that he jumped off the tractor, ran away, and the tractor piled through the fence at the end of the land and came to rest all buggered against some trees. The neighbor got hold of the police. He said, how can these bastards in uniform get tires, and we can't? That caused me no drama at the time. The drama came later. We got to Swartkop's and out came the first blokes with the aerosols to spray the yellow fever mosquitoes. Bit of a waste of time because we flew with the door wide open. Swartkop's in those days had no runways, so I landed crosswind and ran right to the far side over the ridge, and the duty pilot, he couldn't see me because I had the door facing the other way. When we landed we ran, and ran, and ran, right to the end of the runway, so the blokes tried to put the door on quickly, but the aircraft was bent and it would not fit. Then I had to get rid of the rifles and ammunition, and we piled out the rifles and the ammunition into the grass. We would come back later for the guns and ammunition. So, we stopped on the tarmac and everyone was very pleased to see us except the health people, because they couldn't spray the airplane because it was wide open. I explained that the door would not close because the aircraft was bent, so we had to take the door off. There it lay. So, I got away with that. Then they couldn't find anyone to fly this damn thing to Germiston, so I had to get back in the plane and fly it to Germiston 31st 4.00 hours. Then I thought I had got away with everything, and then the police got hold of me and I had to explain. So, I got in my car and went up and filled it with tires, and did another trip up and filled it with tires, and I could not carry more, and my brother got away with a whole lot. I never heard any more about it until the end of war, and I was clearing myself and I went into DMI, military intelligence, and I saw my FILEG documents. Was about 3 inches thick, and they had a look through my file and I was court-martialed. General Brink and I were great buddies, and the final letter in the file, read, in view of this officer's distinguished war record, and. That was the end of our trip. Note from Len. I learnt about the court-martial from a Pretoria Rotarian by the name of Jock. Jock was a bit older and knew Bob as a pupil pilot. He was Bob's senior officer. Bob was a very accomplished pilot and a fantastic sportsman, a true sportsman. He had a motorbike accident and broke his leg. He was in the Roberts Heights Military Hospital, changed to Vortrekkinghoogte, and I hear now changed again, when the surgeons came in to tell him that they want to amputate his leg. Bob was in tears and sent for his CO, Jock. Jock told me that here has this fantastic pilot and sportsman, in tears, pleading with me to stop them cutting off his leg. So Jock saw the surgeon and pleaded with him to do anything to try and save Bob's leg. The surgeon promised to try. He patched up the broken bones with a metal plate. Bob recovered, but he always walked with a slight limp, as one leg was slightly shorter than the other. He carried on with his instructor's rating and at one time had more hours on tiger moths than anyone else has ever had. He learned to fly on Sopwith camels and flew many WWII types. He was an absolute master at aerobatics. After the war he flew Dragon Rapids passenger version and then de Havilland Doves for Sir Ernest Oppenheimer and Anglo-American. He can tell many amusing stories, as for instance when a typical old lady inspected his aeroplane at an airfield during an air show. She was appalled that it was made of cloth. To prove it she took her umbrella and poked holes in the sides, tail, ailerons and rudder. Bob went right through the war, WWII, with that plate in his leg. Remember, he had joined the Air Force well before the war. He was still playing a good game of golf, although with a golf cart, right up to the time of his death at the age of 85 years.